The sand was in the creases of his expensive leather shoes, a gritty, persistent reminder of a Saturday morning that had dismantled 4 years of carefully constructed silence. It was a fine, pale silt, the kind that only exists in the high-end playgrounds of the city's central district, and it looked absurd against the polished black calfskin. Elias sat on the edge of the king-sized hotel bed, the air conditioning humming a low, mechanical dirge that seemed to vibrate in his very marrow. He didn't take the shoes off. He didn't move to brush the grain away. He simply stared at it the way a man might stare at the wreckage of a house he had thought was earthquake-proof. The room smelled of nothing. That was the problem with these luxury suites. They were designed to be sterile, to erase the presence of anyone who had stayed there before. There was no cedar, no rain, no salt. There was only the ghost of a scent he hadn't been able to find in 4 years, and the sudden, terrifying realization that he had been looking for it in the wrong hemisphere. He closed his eyes, and the silence of the room was replaced by the high, sharp whistle of a distant kite and the rhythmic scrape of a plastic shovel against a wooden border. He could still feel the way the air had curdled when he stopped walking. He could still see the curve of a neck he knew better than his own signature, bowed over a paperback book that looked like it had been dropped in a bathtub and dried in the sun. The world had gone very, very quiet, even though the park was full of people. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a landslide. 4 years is a long time to build a life out of paper and ambition. In London, the light is different. It's gray and heavy, a constant pressure that makes you work harder just to feel like you're breaking the surface. Elias had thrived in it. He had taken the promotion, the international liaison role, the corner office with the view of the Thames that looked like a postcard on the good days and a charcoal drawing on the bad ones. He had told himself he was doing it for them. He had told himself that the distance was a temporary tax on a permanent future. He remembered the last night in the apartment, the way the boxes had created a labyrinth of their shared history. Minjun had been quiet, but Minjun was always quiet. He was the steady pulse to Elias's frantic heartbeat. He had packed Elias's sweaters with a precision that felt like a blessing. He had promised to follow in 6 months, as soon as his own contract ended, as soon as the logistics were settled. He had kissed Elias at the airport gate with a ferocity that felt like an anchor, and Elias had flown away believing he was still tethered to the earth. He hadn't known the rope had been cut the moment he cleared security. He hadn't known that the "Go" Minjun whispered against his collarbone wasn't an invitation to lead, but a permission to leave. Now, the city felt like a suit that no longer fit. Elias had returned for a 6-week consultancy project, a victory lap for the man who had conquered the London markets. He had planned to spend his mornings running the familiar paths of the park, reacquainting himself with the geography of his youth. He hadn't planned on the math. He hadn't planned on the way the universe sometimes waits for you to be at your most arrogant before it drops the floor out from under you. He had seen the boy first. It was the eyes, that specific, startling shade of amber that Elias saw every morning in the mirror, framed by lashes that were too long for a child and a brow that was already knit in a look of profound, structural concentration. The boy was kneeling in the sand, his small hands working with a seriousness that bordered on the religious. He wasn't playing, he was engineering. He was building a fortress with a moat that actually held water, his tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth in a gesture Elias recognized with a physical jolt that felt like a heart attack. And then Elias had looked up. He had looked past the fortress, past the moat, to the man sitting on the bench 3 meters away. Minjun looked older, not in the way of wrinkles or gray hair, but in the way of a mountain that has endured a particularly long winter. There was a thinness to his shoulders that hadn't been there before, a weariness in the way his hands rested on his knees. He was wearing a coat that Elias recognized, a heavy wool thing that was starting to fray at the cuffs. He looked like a man who had learned how to survive on very little sleep and even less help. The air between them didn't just crack. It shattered. The boy had been the one to break the spell. He had looked up from his moat, his amber eyes tracking the shadow that Elias cast over his work. He didn't look afraid. He looked observant. He looked at Elias's shoes, those $1,000 shoes that were entirely out of place in a sandbox, and he spoke with the clear, unvarnished authority of the very young. "Your shoes are dirty," the boy said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Elias had forgotten how to breathe. He had forgotten how to be a consultant, a leader, a man of the world. He was just a ghost standing in the sun, staring at a child who had his face and a man who had his heart, and the sand was filling the silence between them like an hourglass that had finally run out. Minjun had looked up then. The paperback book had slipped from his fingers, hitting the grass with a dull thud. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just went very, very pale, the kind of white that looks like bone, and he whispered a name that Elias hadn't heard spoken with that specific inflection in 1,460 days. It wasn't a greeting. It was a surrender. The hotel room was too cold. Elias stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, in a small apartment that probably smelled of laundry detergent and apple juice, Minjun was putting that boy to bed. He was tucking the covers around those small, engineering shoulders. He was probably reading a story about trucks or dragons, his voice steady and calm, betraying nothing of the earthquake that had hit them both at 11:15 that morning. Elias felt a surge of anger so sharp it made his teeth ache. It was a selfish anger, a jagged thing that wanted to demand an explanation for every missing day, every missed first step, every tooth that had fallen out without him there to catch it. But beneath the anger was the shame. It was the shame of a man who realized he had been playing at being successful while the person he loved was playing at being a god, creating a whole person, a whole world, out of nothing but silence and a decision made in the dark. He remembered the letters he had sent those first few months. Enthusiastic, self-absorbed descriptions of the London fog and the office politics. Minjun's replies had been shorter, more focused on Elias, always pushing the conversation back to the dream. "I'm so proud of you," Minjun had written. "Don't worry about here. Just do what you went there to do." Elias had taken it as support. He hadn't realized it was a shield. He hadn't realized that every time Minjun said, "Don't worry," he was actually saying, "I am carrying this so you don't have to." There is a specific scent to a hospital hallway at 3 o'clock in the morning. It is the smell of floor wax and adrenaline, of things being born and things being lost in the same breath. 5 years ago, Elias had stood in a hallway like that, but it hadn't been for a birth. It had been for a signature. He had been signing the papers for his visa, for his relocation, for the life he thought he wanted. He remembered the way the pen had felt in his hand, heavy and expensive. He remembered the way Minjun had stood by the window, the sun catching the back of his dark hair. "You should go," Minjun had said. "It's what you've worked for since we met. I'll be right behind you." It was a lie so beautiful that Elias had built a cathedral inside it. He hadn't noticed the way Minjun's hand had hovered over his own stomach. He hadn't noticed the way the scent of cedar and citrus, their combined bond, had shifted, becoming something more complex, something muted by the onset of a biological secret. Minjun had known then, or he had suspected, but he had looked at Elias, at the hunger in his eyes for a world bigger than the one they shared, and he had made a choice. He had decided that Elias's dream was more important than Elias's presence. It was a gift that felt like a theft. The second meeting happened in a coffee shop that smelled of burnt beans and damp umbrellas. It was 3 days after the park. Elias had spent those 72 hours in a state of functional paralysis, attending meetings he didn't remember and eating meals he didn't taste. Minjun had agreed to meet him only after Elias had promised, via a frantic, rambling text message, that he wouldn't just show up at the apartment. They sat at a small, wobbly table in the back. Minjun was alone this time. The boy Leo, his name was Leo, was with a neighbor. Minjun didn't order anything. He just sat with his hands wrapped around a paper cup of hot water, his knuckles white. He looked like he was waiting for a sentence to be carried out. Elias wanted to reach across the table and grab those hands. He wanted to shake him. He wanted to kiss him until the last 4 years dissolved into a bad dream. Instead, he said the only thing that made sense. "Why?" The word was small, but it carried the weight of a mountain. Minjun didn't look up. His voice was a thin wire, stretched to the breaking point. "Because you were finally happy, Elias. You were finally becoming the person you talked about being when we were 20. If I had told you, you would have stayed. You would have taken a job you hated in a firm that didn't appreciate you, and you would have looked at me every day and wondered what you gave up. I didn't want to be the reason your world stayed small. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. It was the logic of a martyr, the devastating, lopsided reasoning of someone who loves you more than they love themselves. You decided for me, Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was hard. You didn't give me the choice to be a father. You didn't give me the choice to be a partner. You decided that my career was worth more than our son. Minjun finally looked up then, and the pain in his eyes was so vast it made Elias flinch. I decided that you were worth more than a sacrifice, Minjun whispered. I thought I was being strong. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I raised him well enough, it wouldn't matter that you weren't there. But then he started growing your eyes. He started building things the way you do, with that same tilt of the head, that same refusal to quit until the foundation is perfect. And every time I looked at him, I realized I hadn't saved you from anything. I had just divided us into two different kinds of lonely. They sat in the silence of that realization for a long time, the steam from the hot water rising between them like a ghost. The dream Elias had chased across an ocean suddenly looked very small and very cold compared to the warmth of a 4-year-old boy who thought dirty shoes were the most interesting thing about a stranger in the park. In the weeks that followed, the consultancy project became a secondary concern. Elias spent his mornings in the park, not running, but sitting on the bench with a book he didn't read, waiting for a flash of a yellow raincoat or the sound of a plastic shovel. Minjun was cautious. He was like a man trying to tame a wild animal that he used to keep as a pet. He knew the movements, but he didn't trust the teeth. Leo was less complicated. Children have a terrifying ability to accept the impossible if it is presented with enough snacks and a willingness to sit in the dirt. The first time Elias was allowed to join them in the sandbox, he felt like he was being inducted into a secret society. He sat on the wooden edge, his suit trousers abandoned for a pair of jeans he had bought at a department store down the street, and he watched Leo work. The boy was building a bridge. It was an ambitious structure, involving several large stones and a precarious amount of wet sand. "It's gonna fall," Elias said softly. He couldn't help it. The engineer in him was screaming at the lack of a central support. Leo didn't look up. He just patted the side of the bridge with a damp palm. "I'll just build it again," he said. "That's what Papa says. You just keep building until it stays." Elias looked at Minjun, who was watching them from the bench. Minjun's expression was unreadable, a mask of careful neutrality, but his scent, that faint, lingering trace of sun-warmed linen, was beginning to bloom again, edging out the cold, sterile smell of the city. It was a beginning, but it felt like a marathon. The transition from stranger to the man who reads stories was slow and punctuated by moments of intense, quiet agony. Elias moved out of the hotel and into a short-term apartment 3 blocks away from Minjun. He stopped wearing the expensive shoes. He started learning the names of the dinosaurs. He learned that Leo didn't like the crusts on his sandwiches and that he was afraid of the sound of the vacuum cleaner but not of the dark. Every piece of information felt like a precious stone, something Elias had to earn and then guard. But the distance between him and Minjun remained. They were like two people standing on opposite sides of a canyon, shouting across the wind. They could hear each other, but they couldn't touch. The intimacy they had once shared, the way they could communicate with a look, the way their scents used to braid together until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began, was gone. In its place was a polite, devastating kindness. Minjun treated him like a guest in his own life. He was helpful, he was communicative, he was flexible with the schedule. But he never asked Elias to stay for dinner. He never reached out to touch his hand. He was a man who had learned to be whole without Elias, and that was the hardest thing for Elias to face. He had expected anger. He had expected a fight. He hadn't expected to be unnecessary. One night, 6 weeks after the return, the rain finally broke the heat. It was a torrential downpour, the kind that turns the city streets into rivers and makes the world feel small and enclosed. Leo was asleep. Elias and Minjun were in the small kitchen of the apartment, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and the tea Minjun had made out of habit. The silence was different tonight. It wasn't polite. It was heavy, charged with the electricity of the storm outside. Elias looked at the small space. The mismatched chairs, the drawings taped to the refrigerator, the single pair of adult shoes by the door. "This is where you were," he said. His voice was rough, the sound of someone who hadn't spoken in hours. "Every night for 4 years. This is where you were while I was at dinner parties in Mayfair." Minjun didn't look at him. He was staring at the steam rising from his mug. "I wasn't just here, Elias. I was everywhere. I was at the doctor's office. I was at the park. I was at the grocery store with a screaming toddler and 2 bags of groceries and a broken umbrella. I was in the middle of a life that I didn't know how to explain to you. So I didn't. I just lived it." Elias stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. "You should have told me. I don't care about the dream, Minjun. I don't care about the promotion. I would have come back in a heartbeat." Minjun finally looked up, and for the first time the neutrality was gone. The mask had cracked. "And that's why I couldn't tell you," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Because you would have come back. And you would have hated me for it. You would have looked at this kitchen and this life and you would have felt like you were in a cage. I loved you enough to let you go, Elias. Why can't you understand that? Because it wasn't love." Elias stepped closer, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "It was control, Minjun. You didn't trust me to choose you. You didn't trust us to be strong enough to have both. You decided that I was too fragile to handle the truth. And you robbed me of 4 years of my son's life to protect a version of me that didn't even exist anymore. I didn't want to be the person in London. I wanted to be the person with you. You were the dream, Minjun. You were always the dream." The word hung in the air, vibrating with the force of a truth that had been buried too deep for too long. Minjun's breath hitched, a small, wounded sound that cut through Elias more than any shout could. The mug of tea trembled in his hands, and then, slowly, he set it down on the table. The scent of cedar and rain, the alpha's distress and the omega's sorrow, finally collided, swirling together in the cramped kitchen until the air was thick with the weight of it. Minjun reached out, his fingers grazing the sleeve of Elias's sweater, and then he was sobbing. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was a total collapse, the sound of a man who had been holding up the sky for 4 years and finally let it fall. Elias gathered him in, pulling him close until there was no space left between them, until the 4 years were just a shadow on the wall. He buried his face in Minjun's neck, breathing in the scent of salt and home, and he realized that the wreckage wasn't the park or the secret or the silence. The wreckage was the idea that they could ever be separate. They were the same structure, built on the same foundation, and even if parts of it had crumbled, the bones of it were still there, waiting to be rebuilt. 2 months later, the city was beginning to turn toward autumn. The light was sharpening, the leaves in the park turning the color of Leo's eyes. Elias had officially requested a permanent transfer back to the city office. It was a demotion in title, a step back in the corporate hierarchy, and he had never felt more successful in his life. He was sitting on their bench, watching Leo attempt to build a sandcastle that looked suspiciously like a skyscraper. Minjun was sitting next to him, his shoulder pressed against Elias's. The air between them was different now. It was quiet, but it was a shared quiet, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what the other person is thinking. Minjun had been nauseous for 3 days. He hadn't said anything, but Elias had noticed the way he looked at the coffee in the morning, the way he had started carrying a pack of crackers in his bag. He had noticed the way the scent of sun-warmed linen had changed again, becoming something richer, something grounded and heavy. He waited until Leo was distracted by a passing dog before he spoke. "We're not doing it that way this time," he said softly. Minjun didn't look surprised. He just leaned his head against Elias's shoulder, his eyes fixed on their son. "No," he whispered. "We're not. I'm not making that decision alone again." Elias reached down and took Minjun's hand, his thumb tracing the familiar lines of his palm. "We're going to need a bigger apartment," Elias said, "and probably more sand." Minjun laughed then, a short, bright sound that made Leo look up from his skyscraper. The boy studied them for a moment, his amber eyes moving from his father to his papa, and then he nodded, as if he had reached a conclusion about the structural integrity of the scene. "Is he going to live here now?" Leo asked, pointing a sandy finger at Elias. Minjun looked at Elias, and for the first time in 4 years, there was no shadow in his eyes. "We're working on it," he said. Leo considered this, his brow furrowing in that way that Elias now knew meant he was weighing the pros and cons. "Okay," Leo said. "But he has to read the story right. The one about the dragon. He always does the voices wrong." Elias smiled, a genuine, aching thing that felt like it was healing something deep inside his chest. "I'll practice," he promised. Leo accepted this with a solemn nod and returned to his skyscraper, his small hands working with a focus that no longer felt like a tragedy, felt like a legacy. The epilogue of a life isn't written in the big moments. It's written in the Saturday mornings when the air is crisp and the coffee is hot and the shoes are dirty. It's written in the way a 4-year-old boy looks at his father and sees a hero instead of a ghost. It's written in the second chance that neither of them deserved but both of them fought for. As the sun began to set over the park, casting long golden shadows across the sand, Elias looked at the grain of silt still stuck in the seam of his jeans. He didn't brush it away. It was a part of him now. It was the foundation. They would build and it would fall and they would build again. They would keep building until it stayed. And this time they would do it together. The silence was finally gone, replaced by the sound of a child's laughter and the steady, rhythmic breathing of a man who was no longer alone. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The world was small and the world was quiet, and for the first time in 4 years Elias was exactly where he was supposed to be. The dream hadn't been across the ocean. It had been right here in the sand, waiting for him to come home and get his shoes dirty. He closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of his family. Cedar, linen, and the faint, sweet smell of a future that was no longer a secret. They were whole. They were broken. They were real. And as the first star appeared in the darkening sky, Elias realized that the gap between what he remembered and what had happened didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what happened next. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't in a hurry to find out. He was happy to just sit on the bench and watch the sandcastle grow, one handful at a time, until the foundation was finally perfectly, undeniably right. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the city outside was just a hum of distant traffic and the apartment was filled with the soft, rhythmic breathing of those he loved, Elias often found himself thinking about the airport. He would see Minjun standing there, his face a mask of supportive lies, and he would feel the phantom weight of the suitcases he had been so eager to carry. He realized now that he hadn't been flying toward a future. He had been flying away from his own heart. The London office, the Thames, the accolades, they were all just noise designed to drown out the silence of the person who wasn't there. He remembered a specific evening in London, a rainy Tuesday when he had sat in a pub with a group of colleagues, celebrating a deal that had made the firm millions. He had been laughing, holding a glass of expensive scotch, and for a split second, he had felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest. He had thought it was indigestion. He had thought it was the stress. Now, he knew it was the exact moment Leo had taken his first step. He had felt the tether snap across 3,000 miles, and he had ignored it. He had ordered another drink. The guilt of that realization was a heavy thing, a stone he would have to carry for the rest of his life, but it was a stone that anchored him to the present. It reminded him that every moment was a choice, and that he would never choose the noise over the silence again. He would never choose the dream over the dreamer. He watched Minjun shift in his sleep, the moonlight catching the line of his jaw, and he felt a profound sense of peace. The gap was closed. The story was whole. And as he finally drifted off, the last thing he saw was the image of a sandcastle, strong and tall, with a foundation that reached all the way to the center of the earth. It wasn't perfect. It was better than perfect. It was theirs. The morning would come, and the shoes would get dirty again, and the boy would ask 1,000 questions, and the man would answer them all with a patience he hadn't known he possessed. They were a family of engineers, after all. They knew how to build things that lasted. They knew that the most beautiful structures were the ones that had been rebuilt from the wreckage of what came before. And as the sun rose over the city, casting its light into the small kitchen with the mismatched chairs, Elias knew that they were finally, truly home. The 4 years were gone, but the 40 years ahead were waiting, and he wouldn't miss a single second of them. Not for all the dreams in the world. Not for all the gold in London. He was an alpha with a son and a partner and a second chance, and that was the only dream he ever needed to chase. The sand was in his shoes, and for the first time he didn't want to brush it off. He wanted to keep it there, a gritty, persistent reminder that the most important things in life are the ones you have to work for, the ones you have to fight for, and the ones you have to be brave enough to stay for. He was staying. He was never leaving again. And as he reached out to pull the blanket over Minjun's shoulders, he knew that the silence was finally, beautifully, over. The story had found its voice, and it was singing a song of salt and cedar and home. It was a song that would never end, a melody that would carry them through the winters and the summers, through the building and the falling, until the very end of time. And as the world woke up around them, Elias smiled. He was ready. He was home. He was whole. And that, in the end, was the only truth that mattered. The sand was fine, the light was gold, and the shoes were dirty. It was a perfect morning. It was the first day of the rest of their lives, and Elias couldn't wait to see what they would build next. Because whatever it would be built together. Hand in hand, heart in heart, scent in scent. The way it was always meant to be. The way it would always be from now on. The age of the child had begun, and with it, the age of the father, the age of the partner, and the age of the man who finally realized that the greatest adventure of all wasn't the one he went looking for, but the one that had been waiting for him all along, building sandcastles in the park and waiting for him to finally come home.